He had everything money could buy: private jets, mansions across 3 continents, a fortune that could end world hunger twice over. But on a cold October night in 2019, sitting behind the wheel of a beat-up Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it, wearing a stained polo shirt that smelled like cigarettes he'd never smoked, 62-year-old Alexander Mitchell realized something that terrified him more than bankruptcy ever could. He was completely, utterly alone. And the woman who was about to step into his car, soaking wet from the rain, angry about being late to her second shift at the hospital, would become the only person who ever truly saw him. Not his bank account, not his empire, just him. What happened next would destroy everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and what it means to be human. This is the story of a man who had to become invisible to finally be seen. For 37 years, Alexander Mitchell built Mitchell Global Industries from a single patent into a technology empire worth $8.4 billion. He had 5 homes he never lived in, a collection of cars he never drove, and a phone filled with contacts of people who would take his call in under 3 seconds, not because they cared about him, but because they cared about what he could do for them. His wife had left him 14 years earlier, taking their daughter Emma with her. The divorce settlement was $300 million. His ex-wife later admitted to a reporter off the record that she'd never loved him. She'd loved the idea of never having to worry about money again. His daughter hadn't spoken to him in 6 years, not since he'd missed her college graduation because of a merger meeting in Singapore that, in hindsight, hadn't mattered at all. Every birthday gift he sent came back unopened. Every attempt at reconciliation met with silence. By 2019, Alexander Mitchell had everything except the one thing that actually mattered: someone who gave a damn about Alexander, not about Mitchell Global Industries. So he did something that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew him. He became someone else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In September 2019, Alexander Mitchell did something his board of directors, his lawyers, and his security team would have physically prevented if they'd known. He created a fake identity, Anthony Ricci, Tony to his passengers. He bought a 2008 Honda Civic with cash from a used car lot in Queens, New York, under this fake name. He rented a studio apartment in Astoria for $900 a month, paid 6 months up front, no questions asked. He bought clothes from Goodwill, learned how to make coffee in a $4 French press instead of having his chef prepare it, and he signed up to drive for a rideshare app under his alias, passing the background check with documents that cost him $20,000 to forge. His assistant, Margaret Chen, who'd worked for him for 19 years, was the only person who knew. She'd walked into his office one afternoon in late August and found him researching how to apply for a rideshare driver position. Margaret had seen him through 3 heart attacks, 2 divorces if you counted the first marriage before the money, and the death of his parents. She'd never seen him cry until that day. He told her he just wanted to know if anyone could love him when he had nothing to offer. She helped him create the identity, made him promise to check in with her every night, and kept his secret, even when the board started asking questions about why he was suddenly unavailable most evenings. The rules Alexander set for himself were strict. No expensive watches, no designer anything, no slipping up and mentioning details from his real life. He drove from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., 4 nights a week. He kept conversation minimal at first, still learning how to talk to people who weren't trying to pitch him investments or ask for donations. He learned that most people don't actually look at their drivers. They get in, scroll through their phones, get out. It was exactly the invisibility he'd been looking for. For the first time in decades, nobody wanted anything from him. Nobody knew his name, his company, his net worth. He was just Tony, the guy with the slightly musty car who always had mints in the cup holder and never tried to make awkward small talk unless the passenger wanted to. He picked up college kids heading to parties, exhausted parents coming home from double shifts, couples going on first dates, people having the worst nights of their lives, people having the best. And slowly, carefully, He started to remember what it felt like to just exist in the world as a person, not as a walking dollar sign. 3 weeks into his experiment, he picked up a nurse named Clara Davis. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in October, raining hard enough that visibility was terrible. She practically fell into his back seat, soaked through, apologizing for dripping all over his car, clutching a coffee that had already gone cold. She was 34 years old, though she looked older in that moment, exhausted in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. She gave him the address, a hospital on the other side of Queens, and immediately pulled out her phone. Alexander, Tony in that moment, noticed her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from something else. Stress, maybe. Fear. He didn't ask. He'd learned that unsolicited questions felt invasive to tired people, but then her phone rang, and everything changed. Clara answered the call on speaker, probably by accident. Alexander could hear a woman's voice, agitated, speaking fast. It was her babysitter, 17-year-old Sophie from the apartment next door. Sophie's mom had just called. There was a family emergency. She had to leave right now. Could Clara come home? Clara's voice cracked when she answered. She explained she was already late for her shift. She was covering for another nurse who'd called in sick. If she didn't show up, she could lose her job. She'd already been written up twice this month for attendance issues because her son Dylan had been sick with pneumonia. There was a long pause. Then Sophie said something that made Alexander's chest tighten. She said Dylan was asking for his mom. He'd woken up from a nightmare and wouldn't go back to sleep. He was crying. Sophie didn't know what to do. She was sorry. She had to go. Clara closed her eyes. In the rearview mirror, Alexander watched her face crumple, then forcibly smooth itself back into something resembling composure. She hung up, called the hospital, explained in a shaking voice that she couldn't make her shift. There was a family emergency. She was so sorry she knew this was the 3rd time this month. She listened to whatever was being said on the other end, said okay, said she understood, hung up. Then she just sat there in the back seat of his car, rain hammering the roof, and cried. Not loud, dramatic crying. The quiet kind. The kind that comes from someone who's used to crying alone, who's learned to make herself small even in her grief. Alexander, who'd spent 30 years in boardrooms learning to hide emotion, who'd perfected the art of the neutral expression, felt something crack open in his chest. He pulled over, turned around, asked if she was okay. Stupid question. Obviously she wasn't. But Clara wiped her face, apologized again for the water, for the drama, for everything. She said she was fine. She'd figure it out. She always did. Then she asked him to change the destination. Take her home instead. She'd pay the cancellation fee. It was fine. Alexander canceled the ride, told her the trip was free, don't worry about it, started driving toward her address. And then, because he genuinely wanted to know, because something about her exhaustion felt familiar in a way he couldn't name, he asked what had happened. Clara laughed, not a happy sound. She said everything and nothing, said she was a single mom trying to raise a 7-year-old on a nurse's salary in one of the most expensive cities in the world, said her ex-husband had disappeared 2 years ago, stopped paying child support, changed his number, essentially vanished. Said her son had been sick, really sick, missed 3 weeks of school, and she'd burned through all her sick days and most of her savings on medical bills because her insurance was terrible. Said she'd finally gotten him healthy again, got him back to school, picked up extra shifts to try to rebuild the emergency fund she'd depleted, and now she was about to lose her job anyway because she couldn't be in 2 places at once. Alexander listened. Didn't offer solutions, didn't try to fix it. Just listened. Something he'd forgotten how to do. Clara kept talking, like a dam had broken. She said the hardest part wasn't the money, though the money was crushing. It was the guilt. The constant gnawing guilt of knowing her son needed her, and she couldn't be there because she was working to keep a roof over their heads. She said Dylan was such a good kid, never complained, did his homework without being asked, drew her pictures of them together, always smiling, even though she knew he was lonely. She said she was terrified she was failing him, That one day he'd grow up and remember his childhood as the time his mom was never around, and he'd resent her for it, and she wouldn't even be able to blame him because she resented herself for it. Alexander pulled up to her building. Old apartment complex, paint peeling, one of the security lights flickering. Clara gathered her bag, thanked him for listening, apologized again for falling apart. Then she said something that would replay in Alexander's mind every night for the next 6 months. She said, "People with money don't understand what it's like to be invisible, to work yourself to exhaustion and still not be enough, to love someone with everything you have and still fail them because the world isn't built for people like us." Then she got out of the car, walked into her building, and Alexander sat there in the rain, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and realized he'd just experienced something he'd been searching for his entire adult life. Someone had been real with him. Not because she wanted something, not because she was trying to impress him, but because in that moment, in the back of a stranger's beat-up car, she'd needed to say it out loud, and he'd happened to be there to hear it. He drove home to his real apartment, the penthouse in Manhattan with floor-to-ceiling windows and artwork worth more than Clara probably made in 5 years. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about her words, about Dylan, about the guilt in her voice, about the fact that he had the power to solve every single one of her problems with an amount of money that was, to him, essentially a rounding error, and she had no idea. The next morning he called Margaret, told her he needed her to do something for him, and she couldn't ask questions. He gave her Clara's name and address, the only information he had, asked her to find out everything she could. What Margaret discovered over the next 3 days painted a picture of someone who'd been dealt an impossible hand and was somehow still playing with grace. Clara Davis, 34, registered nurse at Queen's General Hospital for 8 years, previously married to Marcus Davis, divorced 2 years ago after he was arrested for embezzlement from the accounting firm where he'd worked. Marcus served 18 months, got out, disappeared. Left Clara with their son Dylan, now 7 years old, and approximately $80,000 in debt from legal fees and loans she'd taken out, trying to keep them afloat during the trial. She'd worked her way through nursing school while pregnant, graduated with honors, never missed a shift until Dylan got sick with pneumonia last spring. Hospital administration had her on a performance improvement plan for attendance issues, which was corporate speak for one more problem and you're fired. Her apartment was rent-controlled, 600 square feet, 1 bedroom. She slept on the couch so Dylan could have the bedroom. Her credit score was 412. She had $347 in her checking account. Her car had been repossessed 4 months ago. She took the subway and ride shares everywhere now, which explained why she'd been in Alexander's car that night. She had no family in the area. Her parents were deceased. Father died when she was 19 from a heart attack. Mother died 3 years ago from cancer. No siblings. Her entire support system was her next-door neighbor Sophie, who babysat Dylan occasionally, and a friend from the hospital who sometimes helped with school pickups. Margaret also found something else. Dylan's medical records, which she'd obtained through channels Alexander didn't ask about. The pneumonia had been severe. Dylan had been hospitalized for 6 days. But there was more. Dylan had been diagnosed with asthma, moderate persistent, requiring daily medication and regular monitoring. Clara's insurance covered most of it, but the copays and the inhaler refills were expensive. There were notes in the file about missed follow-up appointments, likely because Clara couldn't afford to take more time off work. The pulmonologist had flagged Dylan as high risk for future complications if his asthma wasn't managed properly. Margaret presented all of this to Alexander in a folder, in his office, at 6 a.m. before anyone else arrived. She asked him what he was planning to do. He said he didn't know. She said, "You're going to help her, aren't you?" He said he wanted to, but he didn't know how, without revealing who he was, and the moment he did that, everything would change. The way Clara had talked to him that night, the honesty, the vulnerability, it only happened because she thought he was nobody, just another driver. The moment she knew he was Alexander Mitchell, billionaire, every interaction would be filtered through that knowledge. She'd wonder about his motives. question whether anything was real. He'd seen it happen 1,000 times. People changed around money. He couldn't let that happen with her, so he made a decision. He'd help her, but anonymously, no contact, no strings, just solve the problems and disappear. It seemed simple. It wasn't. Margaret helped him set up a series of anonymous payments and interventions. First, he paid off Clara's debt, all $80,000. Had it structured to look like it came from a non-profit that helped families of incarcerated individuals with debt relief. Clara received a letter explaining she'd been selected as a recipient, no action required on her part. The debt was simply forgiven. Second, he arranged for Dylan's medical expenses to be covered through a charity fund for children with chronic illnesses. All copays, all medications, all follow-up appointments, fully covered for the next 5 years. Again, a letter arrived explaining Dylan had been enrolled in the program. Third, he had Margaret anonymously contact the hospital administration about Clara's performance plan. He donated $5 million to Queen's General Hospital, with the stipulation that they use a portion to provide backup childcare services for nursing staff dealing with family emergencies. The program launched 2 months later. Clara's performance plan was dropped. Alexander told himself this was enough. He'd helped. He could move on. But he couldn't, because he kept thinking about that conversation, about the way Clara had looked when she talked about her son, about the guilt in her voice. He wanted to know if the help had made a difference, if she was okay, if Dylan was okay. So he did something he knew was crossing a line. He kept driving for the rideshare app, same nights, same areas, hoping, though he wouldn't admit it to himself, that she'd request another ride. It took 6 weeks. December 2019. Cold night, snow threatening but not quite falling. His phone pinged with a pickup request. He accepted before looking at the details. Then he saw the name, Clara Davis. His heart rate spiked. He almost canceled. Didn't. Drove to her building. She got in the car wearing the same coat, carrying a different bag, heading to the hospital for a shift. She didn't recognize him immediately. Why would she? It had been 6 weeks. He was just another driver. But then she looked up, made eye contact in the rearview mirror, and her expression shifted. A small smile. She said, "Wait, I know you. You're the driver from that night, when I had the complete meltdown in your back seat. I'm so sorry about that, by the way. That was not my finest moment." Alexander, Tony, told her not to worry about it. Everyone has bad nights. Asked how she was doing. Clara's entire face changed. She said, "Honestly? So much better." She said the craziest thing had happened. She'd been selected for this debt relief program. Completely out of the blue, all her debt just vanished. And then Dylan got enrolled in this medical charity thing that covered all his medications and appointments. And then her hospital started this new child care backup program. She said it felt like the universe had suddenly decided to cut her a break after 2 years of nothing but problems. She said she'd actually been able to save money for the first time since the divorce. She was building an emergency fund. She'd taken Dylan to see a movie last weekend. First time they'd done something fun in months. She said he was doing so well. His asthma was under control. He'd made the honor roll at school. He was happy. She was happy. She said she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop because this kind of luck didn't just happen to people like her, but so far everything was holding. She said she felt like she could breathe again, literally and metaphorically. Alexander listened to all of this, driving through the dark streets, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Something that felt like mattering. Like his existence had made a tangible, positive difference in someone's life, and she had no idea. They arrived at the hospital. Clara thanked him, said it was nice to see him again, hoped he'd have a good night. Got out, walked inside. Alexander sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking again, trying to process what he was feeling. Then he drove home, called Margaret, told her he'd seen Clara, that she was doing better, that the help had worked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're in love with her, aren't you?" Alexander said no. That was ridiculous. He barely knew her. Margaret said, "You've spent 3 months thinking about a woman you met once. You've restructured her entire life from the shadows, and you just spent 20 minutes sitting in a hospital parking lot processing your feelings about a 5-minute conversation. That's not helping. That's love." Alexander hung up, but he knew she was right. Over the next 4 months, January through April 2020, Alexander's double life became increasingly complicated. He kept driving, kept hoping he'd get Clara as a passenger again. It happened 3 more times. Each time they talked a little longer. She started to recognize him, not as anyone important, just as Tony the driver who seemed to get assigned to her rides more often than random chance would suggest. She joked about it, called him her good luck charm, said every time she rode with him, her night went better. She started to open up, told him about Dylan's science fair project, a volcano that actually worked, about her friend at the hospital who was going through a messy breakup and kept crying in the supply closet, about the elderly patient who told Clara she reminded him of his daughter and held her hand during his treatments, about the small, ordinary details of a life that felt anything but ordinary to Alexander because it was real in a way his life hadn't been real in decades. He told her things too, carefully edited things, said he'd been married once, didn't work out, said he had a daughter he didn't talk to anymore, regretted it every day, said he'd spent most of his life working and wondered if he'd missed the point of everything. Clara told him it wasn't too late to fix things with his daughter, said life was too short for regrets, said everyone deserved a second chance. Alexander wanted to believe her. During these months, his real life started to fracture. The board of Mitchell Global Industries was asking questions. Why was Alexander unreachable most evenings? Why had he missed 3 investor meetings? Why had he turned down a television interview that would have been massive publicity for the company? His COO, David Brennan, who'd worked with Alexander for 15 years, started making quiet inquiries, asking Margaret if everything was okay, if Alexander was sick, if there was something they should know. Margaret kept the secret, but she told Alexander he couldn't keep doing this. One life or the other. He couldn't maintain both. Then, in March 2020, everything started to collapse. A business reporter for a major newspaper got a tip that Alexander Mitchell hadn't been seen in public in months, started investigating, published an article with the headline, "Where is Alexander Mitchell?" questioning whether the reclusive billionaire was even still alive. The stock price for Mitchell Global Industries dropped 11% in one day. The board held an emergency meeting, demanded that Alexander make a public appearance immediately. Alexander showed up to the meeting straight from a driving shift, wearing Tony's clothes, exhausted and smelling like the pine air freshener he kept in the Honda. The board stared at him like he'd lost his mind. David Brennan asked him directly what was going on. Was he having a breakdown? Did he need help? Alexander told them he was fine. He'd just been taking some personal time. David said personal time doesn't mean disappearing for months while the company suffers. He said people were starting to talk. Competitors were circling. There were rumors Mitchell Global Industries was in trouble, that Alexander was stepping down, that the company was being sold. None of it was true, but perception was reality in their industry, and right now the perception was that something was very wrong. Alexander promised to do a press conference, promised to be more present, promised to fix it. He did the press conference, April 2020, stood in front of cameras and gave a prepared statement about how he'd been taking time to focus on philanthropic initiatives and would be returning to his full duties immediately. Answered 3 questions, all softballs, smiled for photos, went home and felt like he was suffocating. Because the truth was, he didn't want to go back. He didn't want boardrooms and investor calls and charity galas where people pretended to care about causes while really just networking. He wanted to drive his beat-up Honda and pick up passengers and maybe, possibly, see Clara again. He wanted the life he'd built as Tony, the invisible man nobody wanted anything from, but that life was becoming impossible to maintain. Margaret told him he had to make a choice, stop driving and go back to being Alexander Mitchell full-time, or commit to this new life and figure out how to actually transition away from the company. Alexander said he didn't know how to do either. He'd built his entire identity around Mitchell Global Industries for 37 years. Without it, who was he? But with it, he was miserable. Then, in late April, Alexander picked up Clara for what would be their last ride as strangers. She got in the car, upset in a way he hadn't seen since that first night. He asked what was wrong. She said her ex-husband had resurfaced. Marcus had called her out of nowhere after 2 years of silence. Said he was clean now, sober, working a steady job. Said he wanted to be part of Dylan's life again. Clara didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to tell him to go to hell. He'd abandoned his son. He didn't get to just waltz back in when it was convenient. But another part of her knew Dylan asked about his dad sometimes, wondered where he was, whether he was okay, whether he still loved Dylan. She didn't want her own anger to be the reason Dylan didn't have a relationship with his father, but she also didn't trust Marcus, didn't know if this was real or if he'd disappear again the moment things got hard. Alexander listened. Then, breaking his own rule about staying invisible, he told her something real. He said he had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, said he'd prioritized work over her for most of her life, said by the time he realized what he'd lost, it was too late. She'd built a life without him, and he didn't know how to be part of it anymore. He said if Marcus was genuinely trying to change, genuinely wanted to be there for Dylan, she should let him try. But protect Dylan. Don't let him get hurt if Marcus leaves again. And maybe, selfishly, give Marcus a chance to not make the same mistakes Alexander had made. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You're not just a driver, are you? There's something else going on with you." Alexander's heart stopped. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I don't know. You just seem like someone who's lived a whole different life, like you're hiding from something, or looking for something." Alexander didn't answer, pulled up to her building. Clara got out, but before she closed the door, she turned back. She said, "Whoever you are, whatever you're running from, I hope you find what you're looking for." Then she was gone. Alexander sat in the car, hands trembling, and realized he'd just been seen. Actually seen. Not Tony, not Alexander Mitchell. Just him, the person underneath all the identities and masks. And it was terrifying. 2 days later, his world exploded. A tech news website published an exposé. Someone had leaked photos of Alexander, taken from a distance, getting into a beat-up Honda Civic in Queens. The headline read, "Billionaire's Secret Life, Alexander Mitchell. Moonlighting as rideshare driver." The article was wild speculation, theories ranging from a publicity stunt to a psychotic break to research for a reality show. But the damage was done. Within hours, every major news outlet had picked it up. The board called another emergency meeting. David Brennan asked point-blank if Alexander had been driving for a rideshare company. Alexander said yes. The room erupted. The board meeting was brutal. David Brennan led the charge, his voice tight with anger Alexander had never heard before. He said this was insane, reckless, a liability nightmare. What if Alexander had gotten into an accident? What if someone had gotten hurt? The lawsuits would have buried the company. What if he'd been recognized earlier and someone had taken advantage of that information? Insider trading, kidnapping. The possibilities were endless. And beyond the legal risks, the optics were terrible. A billionaire pretending to be working class, essentially cosplaying poverty, while real people struggled. The press was going to crucify him. Activists were already calling it exploitative. The board demanded Alexander resign from all public-facing roles immediately. Let David take over as CEO, step back until the scandal died down. Alexander refused, said he wasn't stepping down. This wasn't a scandal. He'd been living his life. Yes, under a fake name, which was admittedly problematic, but he hadn't hurt anyone, hadn't done anything illegal, had actually been a decent driver, according to his ratings. The board stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. One of the board members, Patricia Holbrook, who'd known Alexander since the early days of the company, asked him why. "Why would you risk everything for this? What were you looking for?" Alexander tried to explain, tried to put into words what Clara had made him feel, what those months of invisibility had given him. But it sounded hollow in that boardroom, privileged, tone-deaf. Patricia said gently that Alexander needed help, professional help. This wasn't normal behavior. Alexander left the meeting, went home, turned on the news, saw his face on every channel, read the articles, the think pieces, the Twitter threads. Some people defended him, said he was trying to understand the working class, should be commended for that. Most people didn't, called him a fraud, a bored rich person playing with real people's lives for entertainment. Someone found records of the non-profit that had helped Clara, found the hospital donation, found the medical charity, all anonymous until now. Someone connected the dots, started asking if Alexander had been helping specific passengers, if he'd targeted vulnerable people. The speculation got darker. Was this about control, about power, about a wealthy man manipulating people who couldn't fight back? Clara saw the news. Of course she did. It was everywhere. She was at home with Dylan when her phone started blowing up. Friends from the hospital sending her links, text messages asking if she'd seen the story, if she'd ever had Alexander Mitchell as a driver. She pulled up the articles, saw the photos, recognized the car immediately, felt her stomach drop. Tony wasn't Tony. Tony was Alexander Mitchell, founder and CEO of Mitchell Global Industries, net worth $8.4 billion. The man she'd cried to, the man she'd told about her debt and her struggles and her fears, the man she'd trusted because he was nobody, except he wasn't nobody. He was someone with the power to change her entire life on a whim. And suddenly, everything that had happened over the past 6 months took on a different shape. The debt relief, the medical charity, the hospital's new childcare program. Clara pulled up the dates. The non-profit letter had arrived in October, 3 weeks after that first ride. The medical charity enrollment happened in November. The hospital program launched in December, right after Alexander's donation. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't luck. It was him. He'd done all of it, and he'd never told her. She'd thought the universe had finally cut her a break. Instead, she'd been a project, a charity case, a feel-good story for a billionaire having some kind of midlife crisis. Dylan asked what was wrong. Clara said nothing. "Sweetie, go play in your room for a bit." She needed to think. She tried to make sense of it, tried to figure out if she was angry or grateful or humiliated, or all of it at once. Because objectively, Alexander Mitchell had changed her life, had saved her in a very real way. Without his help, she'd have been drowning in debt for years. Dylan's asthma wouldn't have been managed properly. She might have lost her job. They might have lost their apartment. Everything good that had happened in the past 6 months was because of him. But he'd done it in secret, while pretending to be someone else, while listening to her talk about how people with money didn't understand what it was like to be invisible. He'd let her believe she was talking to an equal, someone who understood struggle, when really she'd been talking to someone who could solve all her problems without even noticing the expense. It felt like a violation, not of her privacy exactly, of something deeper. Her dignity, maybe, her right to know who was in her life and why. That night, a reporter tracked down Clara's address, knocked on her door, asked if she'd ever been a passenger with Alexander Mitchell, if she knew about the financial help, if she wanted to comment. Clara said no to all of it, closed the door, but she knew it was only a matter of time before someone found the connection, printed her name, made her part of the story. She called the hospital, asked for an emergency personal day, called Sophie to watch Dylan. Then she did something she'd never thought she'd do. She looked up the address for Mitchell Global Industries headquarters in Manhattan, took the subway into the city, walked into the gleaming glass building and told the receptionist she needed to speak with Alexander Mitchell. The receptionist, professional and apologetic, said Mr. Mitchell wasn't taking visitors without an appointment. Clara said, "Tell him Clara Davis is here. Tell him if he doesn't come down here in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling every reporter I can find and telling them everything about what he did." The receptionist's eyes widened. She picked up the phone, made a call. Less than 3 minutes later, Alexander Mitchell stepped out of the elevator. Not Tony. Alexander. Expensive suit. Graying hair perfectly styled. Every inch the billionaire. He looked at Clara and something in his expression crumbled. He said, "Clara, I'm so sorry. Can we talk somewhere private?" She said, "You're damn right we're going to talk." They went to a conference room on the executive floor. Glass walls, leather chairs, a view of Manhattan that probably cost more per square foot than Clara's entire apartment. Alexander closed the door, turned to face her. Clara didn't let him speak first. She said, "Did you help me because you felt sorry for me? Or because it made you feel good about yourself? Or was I just some kind of experiment to see how the other half lives?" Alexander said none of those things. Said he'd helped because he'd wanted to, because he could. Because after that first night, he couldn't stop thinking about her and Dylan, and it seemed wrong to have the power to fix her problems and just walk away. Clara said, "So you decided to play God without telling me? Without giving me a choice?" Alexander said he knew it sounded bad. Said he'd convinced himself at the time that anonymity was protecting her, keeping things simple, preventing the weirdness that money brought into relationships. But he'd been lying to himself. The real reason he'd stayed anonymous was because he'd wanted to keep seeing her as Tony, keep having those conversations where she treated him like a regular person. He'd been selfish. He knew that now. Clara said, "You have a daughter you haven't spoken to in 6 years, and instead of fixing that, you decided to adopt a stranger and her kid as some kind of surrogate family?" Alexander flinched. Said yes. Said it was messed up. Said he didn't know how to fix things with Emma, his real daughter, so he'd tried to fix things with Clara and Dylan instead. Tried to be the kind of person who showed up, who helped, even if he had to do it from the shadows. Clara sat down. She was shaking. She said, "I trusted you. The version of you I met anyway. Tony. I told him things I don't tell anyone because I thought he understood what it was like to struggle. And the whole time, you were someone who's never had to worry about money a single day in your adult life. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Alexander said no. Said he couldn't possibly understand. But he wanted to. That's why he'd started driving in the first place, to know what it felt like to be invisible, to be ordinary. Clara laughed, bitter. Said, "You can't buy ordinary, Alexander. You can't put on a cheap shirt and drive a used car and suddenly understand what it's like to live without a safety net. You can always go back to your real life. The rest of us can't." There was a long silence. Then Alexander said something that surprised both of them. He said, "You're right. I was using you. Not consciously, but that's what it was. I was so desperate to feel like I mattered to someone that I inserted myself into your life without permission. And I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that everything I felt during those conversations was real. The respect, the admiration, the way you loved your son and fought for him and kept going when everything was stacked against you. That meant something to me. You meant something to me." Clara wiped her eyes. She said, "I can't decide if you're the most generous person I've ever met or the most manipulative." Alexander said, "Probably both." Said he'd spent his whole life being one or the other, never learned how to just be honest. Clara stood up, said, "I don't know what to do with this. With you, with everything you did. Part of me wants to say thank you. Part of me wants to never see you again." Alexander said, "Whatever you decide, the help stays. The debt is forgiven. Dylan's medical care is covered. That doesn't change. It's not conditional on anything. It's done." Clara said, "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You just made a massive decision about my life, again, without asking me. What if I don't want your help anymore? What if I want to pay my own way?" Alexander said quietly, Then I'll set up an account in your name with the amount I spent. You can donate it, give it away, use it however you want. I won't touch it. I won't have any say. It'll be yours." Clara stared at him, said, "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about the money. It's about the fact that you fundamentally changed my life and I didn't even know it was happening. That's not kindness. That's control." Alexander nodded, said she was right, asked what he could do to make it right. Clara said, "Start by being honest. With me, with your daughter, with yourself. Stop hiding behind fake names and anonymous donations. If you want to help people, help them. But let them see who you are." Alexander said, "What if they don't like who I am?" Clara said, "Then you figure out how to be someone they can like. But you can't do that from behind a mask." She left, walked out of the building, took the subway home, and Alexander stood in that conference room, looking out at the city he'd conquered, feeling more lost than he'd ever felt in his life. The media coverage intensified over the next week. More passengers came forward, people Alexander had driven over those 6 months. A college student who'd mentioned struggling with tuition, who'd mysteriously received a scholarship 3 weeks later. An elderly man whose medical bills had been anonymously paid. A young couple whose car had broken down, who'd found an envelope of cash in their mailbox days later with a note saying, "Pay it forward." Alexander hadn't even remembered half of these interactions. Small moments, tiny interventions, but they'd added up. The public reaction was split. Some people called him a guardian angel, said more billionaires should do this, actually interact with regular people, use their wealth to help. Others called it performative, said if he really cared, he'd advocate for systemic change, not play savior to random individuals. The psychological analyses were endless. Articles about billionaire guilt, about the disconnect between extreme wealth and human connection, about whether it was possible to truly understand poverty from the outside. Through all of it, Alexander stopped hiding, did interviews, admitted he'd been wrong to use a fake identity, said he'd been looking for something he didn't know how to ask for directly, connection without the complication of his wealth, and he'd handled it poorly. He talked about Clara, without using her name, as the person who'd made him realize he'd been living half a life. He talked about his daughter Emma, about the regrets that kept him awake at night, about the fact that he had every resource in the world except the one thing that actually mattered, people who loved him for who he was, not what he had. Some interviews were sympathetic, some were hostile. He did them all. Margaret told him he was doing the right thing. David Brennan told him the stock price was stabilizing. Patricia Holbrook told him he seemed more human than he had in years. But the only opinion Alexander cared about was Clara's, and he hadn't heard from her since that day in the conference room. 3 months passed. July 2020. The news cycle had moved on to other scandals, other stories. Mitchell Global Industries had weathered the storm. Alexander had stepped back from day-to-day operations, letting David run the company while he focused on restructuring his philanthropic work. Not anonymous anymore. Direct. Transparent. He'd established a foundation focused on healthcare access for working families, childcare support, debt relief, all the things that had mattered to Clara. He'd reached out to Emma, his daughter, sent her a letter, not an email, actual handwritten pages. Apologized for everything he'd missed, every birthday, every graduation, every moment he'd chosen work over her. Said he didn't expect forgiveness but wanted her to know he'd spent the past 6 years regretting those choices every single day. Said if she ever wanted to talk, he'd be there. Didn't hear back. Didn't expect to. But he'd said it. Put it out into the world. That was something. He'd stopped driving for the rideshare app, sold the Honda, gave up the apartment in Astoria, let Tony disappear. He missed it sometimes. The simplicity, the anonymity. But Clara had been right. He couldn't live in that in-between space forever. Had to choose who he wanted to be. He chose Alexander Mitchell, but a different version. One who showed up, who was honest, who tried to use what he had to make things better in real, sustainable ways. One August morning, Margaret walked into his office with an envelope. Said it had arrived by courier, marked personal. Alexander opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. From Clara. His hands shook as he read it. She wrote that she'd spent the past 3 months angry, confused, processing everything that had happened. She'd been in therapy, actually, trying to work through her feelings about the help, the deception, all of it. Her therapist had asked her what she would have done if Alexander had introduced himself as a billionaire that first night and offered to solve all her problems. Clara admitted she would have said no, would have been suspicious, would have assumed there was some ulterior motive, which meant, in a weird way, the anonymity had allowed her to receive help she desperately needed, but would have refused out of pride or fear or distrust. She didn't know if that made what he did right, but it made it more complicated than she'd initially thought. She wrote that Dylan was doing great, had started 3rd grade, had visited with his father a few times over the summer, supervised visits that had gone well so far. She was cautiously hopeful, said Marcus seemed different, sober, present. Time would tell. She wrote that she'd been following Alexander's foundation work, had read about the programs he was funding, said it was good work, real work, the kind of thing that would actually change lives. She wrote that she'd thought a lot about their last conversation, about what she'd said, about him needing to be honest, to stop hiding. She said she'd realized she needed to take her own advice, so here was her honesty. She didn't hate him. She'd wanted to. It would have been easier, but she didn't. She was still processing everything, still figuring out how to hold both truths at once, that he'd helped her in ways that changed her life, and that he'd done it in a way that took away her choice. Maybe both things could be true. Maybe people were complicated like that. She wrote that she didn't know if they could be friends, didn't know if she could separate Tony from Alexander, the person she'd trusted from the person who'd deceived her, but she wanted him to know that she forgave him, not because what he did was okay, but because carrying anger around was exhausting, and she'd been exhausted enough for one lifetime. She ended the letter with a question. She asked if he'd ever reached out to his daughter, said Emma deserved to hear from him, said it was never too late to try. Alexander read the letter 3 times. Then he called Margaret, asked her to help him write a response. Margaret said no, said this one he needed to do himself. So Alexander sat down and wrote back, told Clara he appreciated her forgiveness more than she could know, said her letter had meant everything, told her about reaching out to Emma, about not hearing back, about how that silence hurt but was probably deserved, told her he was trying to be better, to do better, said he understood if she didn't want to be friends, but if she ever needed anything at all, she could reach out, not as a billionaire to a charity case, as one flawed human being to another. He sent the letter, didn't expect a response, got one anyway, 3 weeks later. Clara wrote that she appreciated his honesty, said maybe they could try coffee sometime. Just coffee, public place, no ulterior motives, no dramatic gestures, just 2 people talking. Alexander wrote back immediately, said yes, said whenever she was ready. They met in October 2020, almost exactly 1 year after that first ride. Small coffee shop in Queens, halfway between both their worlds. Clara showed up in scrubs, straight from a shift. Alexander showed up in jeans and a sweater, looking more like Tony than he had in months. It was awkward at first. They both knew the history, the complication. But then Clara asked about his foundation work, and Alexander asked about Dylan, and slowly the conversation found its rhythm. Clara told him Dylan had asked about him, had seen Alexander on the news, recognized him as the driver his mom used to talk about, had asked if they were friends. Clara said she'd told Dylan the truth, that it was complicated. Adults sometimes had friendships that were hard to explain. Dylan had apparently nodded sagely and said that made sense. His friend from school had complicated feelings about his divorced parents, too. Alexander laughed, said kids were smarter than adults gave them credit for. Clara agreed, said Dylan wanted to meet him sometime if that was okay, wanted to thank him for helping with his medicine. Alexander felt his throat tighten, said he'd be honored. Clara said, No pressure, no big production. Maybe they could get ice cream or something. Keep it simple. Alexander said simple sounded perfect. They talked for 2 hours, about life, about change, about the strange paths that brought people together. Clara admitted she'd looked up Alexander's foundation, had read the mission statement, said it sounded like he'd actually listened to what she'd told him that first night, about invisibility, about people who worked themselves to exhaustion and still weren't enough. Alexander said she'd changed his life that night, had made him realize he'd been living in a prison of his own making. She'd given him permission to want something different. Clara said, "I didn't give you permission for anything. I just had a breakdown in your car." Alexander said, "Exactly. You were real. That's all I'd wanted. Someone to be real with me." As they were leaving, Clara said something that Alexander would think about for years afterward. She said, "You know what the strangest part is? If you'd just been Tony, actually been a regular driver, I probably would have forgotten about you after that first night. One kind stranger in a long line of strangers. But because you were Alexander Mitchell, because of everything that came after, you became important. I don't know if that's ironic or sad or just how the world works." Alexander said, "Maybe it's all three." They parted ways, promised to stay in touch, and they did. Not constantly, not intensely, but regularly. Clara would send him updates about Dylan, photos of school events, artwork, report cards. Alexander would share stories about his foundation work. Eventually, months later, he shared the news that Emma had finally responded, had agreed to meet for lunch. That lunch had been stiff, formal, both of them testing the waters. But it was something, a beginning. He told Clara he didn't know if he and Emma would ever have a real relationship, but at least they were trying. Clara said that's all anyone could ask for. Trying. 2 years later, December 2022, Alexander attended Dylan's 5th grade holiday concert. Clara had invited him, casual text, said Dylan was singing a solo and would love to have him there. Alexander sat in the back of the school auditorium, surrounded by parents and grandparents and siblings, watched Dylan, now 10 years old, healthy and confident, belt out a slightly off-key but enthusiastic rendition of a holiday song. Afterward, Dylan ran up to him, asked if he'd heard the solo. Alexander said he had, said Dylan was fantastic. Dylan beamed. Clara walked over, camera in hand. Said, "I got the whole thing on video. It's definitely going in the embarrassing footage collection for when he's older." They went for pizza after. Dylan talked nonstop about his friends, about the video game he wanted for Christmas, about the science project he was working on about renewable energy. Normal kid stuff. Alexander listened, asked questions, felt something warm settle in his chest. This wasn't the dramatic redemption arc he'd imagined years ago. It was something quieter, something real. Clara walked him to his car after. Said, "You know, Dylan thinks of you as family now. Uncle Alexander, he calls you when he talks to his friends. I hope that's okay." Alexander said it was more than okay. Clara said, "Good, because you are family. Not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that matters. You show up, you care, you try. That's what counts." So what do you take from this? What do you do with a story like this? Because it's messy, isn't it? It doesn't have a clean moral. Alexander Mitchell did something ethically questionable, lying about his identity, manipulating situations from behind the scenes. But he also changed lives, helped people who desperately needed help. Was that wrong? Was that right? Or is the truth somewhere in between, in the complicated space where most real human decisions actually live? Here's what I think. I think Alexander was a man who had everything except the thing that makes life worth living. Connection. Real, honest, human connection. And in his desperation to find that, he made choices that hurt people, even as he helped them. He took away Clara's agency in the name of generosity. He lied to her in the name of truth. But he also listened to her. Really listened. Changed his entire life because of what she taught him about struggle, about dignity, about what it means to work yourself to exhaustion and still love fiercely, Clara would have been justified in never forgiving him, in walking away and never looking back. But she chose something harder. She chose to hold both truths at once, to accept the help that had changed her life, while also demanding that Alexander be honest about who he was. She chose to let him earn her trust again, slowly, without guarantees. And Alexander? He learned what money can't buy. Can't buy authenticity. Can't buy forgiveness. Can't buy those moments when a 10-year-old kid calls you family because you showed up, consistently, without expecting anything in return. He learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't solving their problems. It's seeing them, really seeing them, treating them like they matter, not because of what you can do for them, but because they're human and they're struggling and they deserve to be seen. So I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. If you were in Clara's position, if someone had changed your entire life from the shadows, solved your most desperate problems without telling you, would you forgive them? Would you be able to move past the deception to accept the help? Or would the violation of trust be too much? How would you feel if someone you'd opened up to, someone you'd been real with, turned out to be someone completely different? Someone with the power to alter your life on a whim? Would that feel like a gift or like manipulation? And if you were in Alexander's position, if you had the resources to help everyone you met who was struggling, would you? Or would you worry about the ethics of it, about taking away people's agency, about the power dynamic that kind of help creates? Is anonymous generosity better than no generosity at all? Or does the anonymity itself create problems? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But I think they're worth asking, because all of us, in our own ways, are trying to figure out how to connect with each other in a world that makes real connection increasingly difficult. We hide behind screens, behind masks, behind versions of ourselves we think people will like. We're all, to some degree, playing a role, trying to be seen without being too vulnerable, trying to help without getting hurt, trying to love without risking rejection. Alexander's story is extreme. Most of us aren't billionaires pretending to be Uber drivers, but the underlying need, the deep human hunger for authentic connection, that's universal. We all want to be seen. We all want to matter. We all want to know that our existence makes a difference in someone else's life. And sometimes, in our desperation to find that, we make mistakes. We lie. We hide. We try to control situations so they'll turn out the way we hope. That doesn't make us evil. It makes us human. The question is what we do next. Do we double down on the deception? Or do we do what Alexander eventually did, which is step into the light, admit we were wrong, and try to do better? Do we give people like Clara the choice to forgive us or walk away? Do we respect their agency even when it terrifies us? I think that's the real story here. Not about money or class or privilege, though those things matter, but about the courage it takes to be honest, to show up as your real self, flaws and all, and hope that's enough. To accept help when you need it. To offer help when you can. To forgive people who've hurt you, not because what they did was okay, but because holding on to anger only hurts you in the end. Alexander Mitchell spent 62 years thinking money was the answer to everything. It took a 34-year-old nurse, exhausted and soaked from the rain, crying in the back seat of a beat-up Honda, to teach him that the things that actually matter can't be bought. They can only be earned, through honesty, through showing up, through trying, failing, and trying again. Dylan's doing great now, by the way. He's 12, wants to be an engineer, still has asthma, but it's managed, has a relationship with both his parents, does well in school, normal kid living a normal life, which is exactly what Clara had fought so hard to give him. Alexander's foundation has helped over 15,000 families in the past 4 years. Real help, transparent help, no more hiding. And Emma, Alexander's daughter, they have lunch once a month now. It's still not easy. There's a lot of hurt to work through, but they're trying, that's something. Clara still works at Queen's General Hospital, still takes the subway, still lives in the same rent-controlled apartment. When reporters asked her years later why she didn't ask Alexander for more help, for money to move to a better place or pay for Dylan's college or any of the things he could easily afford, she said something I think is worth remembering. She said, "I didn't need him to save me, I just needed him to see me. Everything else, I can handle myself." So let me ask you one more time. What would you do? Would you forgive? Would you trust? Would you take the risk of being real with someone, knowing they might hurt you? Would you help someone if you had the power to, even knowing it might complicate things? Would you choose connection over safety? I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone does. But I think Alexander and Clara figured out something important. That life isn't about getting it right the first time. It's about being willing to admit when you've gotten it wrong and showing up anyway. It's about giving people the chance to surprise you, to be more forgiving, more generous, more human than you expected. It's about choosing, again and again, to be honest even when it's terrifying, to be vulnerable even when it might hurt, to try even when failure is possible, because the alternative, the safe path, the path where you never risk anything, that's not living, that's just existing, and Alexander Mitchell had spent 62 years existing before he finally learned how to live. So comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done in Clara's position, in Alexander's position. Tell me about a time someone saw you when you felt invisible, or a time you saw someone else. Tell me your story, because that's what this is all about. Stories, connection, the ways we save each other, and the ways we let ourselves be saved. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, subscribe to this channel. We're going to keep telling stories like this. Real stories about real people navigating impossible situations and somehow, against all odds, finding their way through. I'll see you in the next one.